Dad was a chemical engineer. He worked in his first job in a small factory not far from Guildford, and not long before the war there was an explosion at the factory where he worked, and this resulted in him losing his sight. Not being able to play football and cricket as he had done in his earlier days, walking was the big way of keeping fit, and we as children took him out regularly. And if you're blind and you're walking, you listen to what's about you. He heard blackbirds, he knew blackbirds and thrushes and robins, but when it got to more difficult things, we had to help out. And so it was us that began to learn how to spot and how to listen to more difficult bird sounds, and it all stemmed from that sort of thing, and going on dawn chorus walks as very young children with him. That type of thing definitely encouraged my interest in birds, and so walking and then watching and then learning, I think.
In the spring of 2011, I was approached to make a film about swifts. I had a basic idea of what a swift looked like, and that it probably got its name from being extremely fast. I had a vague recollection of their nests being used to make Chinese soup, and my knowledge of the species ended there. The approach had been made by Chris Mason, a fellow Kirtlington villager. Chris invited me round to his home, and I convinced him, I think, that a head empty of swift knowledge was a good one for the project, as I could assume no level of ignorance greater than my own, and the intended audience was broad. Although he won't have it said, Chris knows a great deal about swifts and birds in general, a passion going back to childhood, helping his blind father develop a knowledge of birdsong. Chris's interest in birds and wildlife generally ran parallel with a 25-year career working for Oxfam, which had included 10 years in Africa. First of all in Uganda, where he met his wife-to-be Olwyn, then Sudan and Ethiopia, where he was country representative for 6 years. Here in Oxfordshire, Chris and a network of what you might call swift nuts were keen to spread the not-so-good news that swift numbers are in decline, and that help is needed to ensure their survival. I fired away a barrage of questions, my first one highlighting the extent of my ignorance. Where might I find a swift? It seems swifts live mainly in nooks and crannies of buildings, especially old ones. But of course it was still March, and swifts, being migratory birds, were on the way from Africa. They just come here to make babies when there's good summer feeding to be had, and why not? So, when should we expect to see them?
They coincide with the arrival of spring, and they are very, very regular about their return. I mean, within a few days, people know exactly when to expect their own swift in their own building or their own village to appear. So from the end of April or early May, we're all looking out every day to see if these great birds are going to return.
Some key swift factoids were shared. For starters, you need to know your swifts from your swallows from your house martins. This, for instance, is not a swift. What is it? Wrong in my case, it's a house martin, and this of course is a swift. Foiled again, well I was. It's a swallow, and neither are related to the swift, whose closest famous relative is, I was surprised to learn, the hummingbird. The swift is the one with the boomerang-like wing profile, its plumage a dull dark brown. Not as pretty as the ones we confuse them with, but boy are they fast. Record holders in fact. A study at Lund University registered a top speed of 111.6 kilometers per hour, which makes it the fastest bird in level flight. It seems the swift nuts, who prefer to be known as swifters, have latched on to a truly remarkable creature. For instance, after a day spent shaving another 100th of a second off the level flight world record, a bird surely needs to get some well-earned shut-eye, So where do they snuggle down at night?
The non-nesting birds will fly up slowly into the higher atmosphere. They will sleep on the wing. They will glide around peacefully, quietly, resting. We don't know a great deal about what happens and how it's done.
Sleeping on the wing. That was impressive enough until Chris hit me with possibly the most mind-blowing swift factoid there is. When a young swift leaves its nest, it doesn't then touch the ground for up to 3 years when they make nests of their own. And that, of course, includes 6 long-haul transcontinental flights. Now, you'd think they'd touch down for a breather now and again. No, a swift may be speed king of the skies, but on terra firma it can hardly even hobble. In fact, the common swift, which is the one we see in British summer skies, has the genus Apus apus, meaning legless. When you live, sleep, feed, and even mate on the wing, the truth is you don't have much use for legs. And evolution has figured out that next to no legs equals improved aerodynamic efficiency. I was getting just a glimpse of the swifter's seasonal obsession and couldn't resist asking Chris how a swifter felt when it came time for their feathered friends to wing it off back to Africa for some winter sunshine.
You do feel a sense of loss, I suppose it is. It's more loss than disappointment, because you know that it's part of the natural cycle, and because of that inevitability you accept it, and you occasionally think of them as they might be wintering in parts of Africa that you know, and you hope that all is well, and you begin to look forward, count the days perhaps until late April when you begin to be looking out again.
Now Chris has a pet project. He wants to see swifts nesting in Kirtlington Church Tower and has risked life and limb fixing carefully designed nesting boxes to the ramparts. But I wondered, what drives him to do this? As one more consumed with human-made things, I wondered, amid a horde of problems facing the world, really, why bother?
I think we should take care of and look after all our wildlife species. It's part of our environment, it's part of our heritage, and whether they're useful to us or not at this particular moment, I think we have a responsibility for looking after the planet and all its habitats and all the things that live here with us.
Even if you don't quite feel it, it's hard to argue with that conviction. My next question, where is the nearest swifter who might be willing to provide an interview? It seemed there was another individual in the village who had been struck down with a serious bout of swift fever, who, curiously enough, had spent a good chunk of his life in East Africa. And there was another connection. He was also called Chris. Chris Poles was born and spent his early childhood in Kenya, where his grandfather founded the Mount Elgon National Park. Chris P is also a bit of an animal boffin, having read zoology down the road at Oxford, and is a fellow of the Zoological Society of London. Living with wife Ruth in a centuries-old stone house in the middle of the village, Chris works in the funding and financial management of small businesses and is clearly a man with his feet planted firmly on the ground. Except when it comes to swifts, where he struck me as being certifiably insane. I caught up with him in his loft, sawing through timbers and knocking holes in the walls, all in the name of swift conservation.
That's something went.
The ambition for what we're doing here is to try and get as large a colony going as possible, because when these birds fly around in these huge phalanxes, it's quite exciting, quite spectacular.
I feared for Chris P that he'd fallen under the other Christopher's influence. I was dead right.
I've been in Kirtlington for 15 years or so now, and I know during that time that swifts have declined a lot. I noticed it even in the first 5 or 8 years that we were here. When Chris and Ruth Poles moved in here and I got to know that they were interested in swifts, I immediately latched onto them and encouraged their own enthusiasm to see if we couldn't do something in this building.
But credit for swift madness where it's due, Mr. Poles hardly seemed to require much by way of encouragement. Incredibly, this Chris had knocked no less than 24 holes in the walls, 16 at one end and 8 at the other, all in the cause of the common swift. My jaw resting on a ceiling joist, Chris made it sound half sensible.
What we're doing here is essentially three things. One is making the inside of the holes that we've created on the outside secure so that birds don't come through into the room and die of starvation. The second thing that we're doing is making it very easy to view them from the inside so that we can enjoy doing that, but also record the number of fledglings, the number of eggs, when they lay, when they fly, and any other sort of interesting data that we may want. And then the third thing is to fix a tiny little camera that will allow us to view one of the holes if they nest there down on the television, so we can watch them day in, day out.
Chris P was clearly going to extraordinary lengths. Hammers, chisels, miniature cameras and yards of cabling threading through the fabric of the building. And the high-tech wizardry of swift conservation didn't end there, as Chris Mason explained.
It really does make a difference if you can encourage the birds by playing a CD of the swift calls. So we are recommending that where people are putting up boxes in the hope of getting swifts, they should accompany that by playing the CD of the calls, and this is what we're doing in the church here and in a number of other new sites around the place where we are hoping to get swifts.
As a swift dunce, I'd actually used this sound as a backdrop to a film about an orchestra made in the summer months, neither having a clue nor caring about which particular birds were making the sound. This was unmistakably the sound of summer, and soon artificial, or in most cases live, it would be resounding across the skies from Spain and the Middle East to Scandinavia as the swifts made their returns from Africa. Swift nuts actually seemed the right name for these people, but they were onto something. I needed to find out more, and pretty fast.